August 3rd, 1944. 15:20 hours. Railway junction, 15 miles inland from Caen, Normandy. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter supervised repair work on a critical rail junction that German forces needed to move reinforcements toward the deteriorating front line. The junction had been damaged by Allied air attack 2 days earlier, and Richter's engineer company had been working continuously to restore rail service. The work was exhausting, but proceeding successfully. One main line was already operational, and the second would be complete within hours. The afternoon was clear and quiet, with no Allied aircraft visible. Richter's men worked efficiently, replacing damaged rails and ties, clearing debris from the previous bombing. The front line was audible, distant artillery creating background rumble that had become so constant that Richter barely noticed it anymore. The war seemed far enough away that the immediate danger was exhaustion and industrial accidents rather than enemy action. Then the ground shook in a way that Richter had never experienced. Not the sharp crack of nearby artillery or the thump of distant bombing, but a deep, sustained vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself, rather than from any weapon. The vibration intensified, becoming audible rumble that suggested something enormous was approaching, though nothing was visible in any direction. The shell arrived without warning. Richter never saw it in flight. The projectile was moving too fast and arrived from too high an angle for visual tracking. What he saw was the impact. A railway locomotive, weighing perhaps 90 tons, was struck by a shell that weighed over 1 ton. The locomotive disintegrated instantly, fragments scattered across 200 yards. The rail line beneath it cratered so deeply that repairing it would require excavating the crater and rebuilding the roadbed completely. The blast knocked Richter to the ground 50 yards from the impact point. When he could see again through the dust and smoke, the junction was destroyed more thoroughly than the previous air attack had achieved. The locomotive was gone. Rails were twisted into sculptures. The second railway line was damaged by fragments, even though the shell had struck the first line specifically. Richter's carefully organized repair operation was now catastrophic casualty evacuation, as engineers who'd been working near the impact had been killed or wounded by the explosion. Richter's report to headquarters emphasized details that seemed important. The shell had arrived from beyond visual range of any artillery Richter had seen. The impact crater was larger than any that field artillery created. The destruction suggested a naval shell, but the nearest Allied naval forces were 15 miles away, across territory held by German forces. His conclusion was simple, but troubling. The British possessed artillery capable of striking deep behind German lines with shells large enough to destroy locomotives in single hits. The weapon that had destroyed Richter's rail junction was a British railway gun, specifically one of the 18-inch monsters that fired shells weighing 1,400 pounds across ranges exceeding 20 miles. The gun had been positioned in a railway tunnel 12 miles from Richter's position, had rolled forward to fire a single, carefully aimed shot, and had withdrawn back into the tunnel before German reconnaissance could locate it. The entire firing sequence from emergence to retreat had taken less than 10 minutes. The Victorian legacy returns. British railway guns represented Victorian military engineering philosophy applied to 20th century warfare through the simple expedient of mounting enormous naval guns on railway carriages and using the existing rail network for mobility that weapons weighing hundreds of tons couldn't achieve through any other means. The concept wasn't new. Railway guns had been used extensively during World War I, with various nations mounting heavy artillery on rail cars to provide long-range fire support. But the weapons had been largely abandoned during the interwar period as being too inflexible, too vulnerable, and too expensive compared to more modern weapon systems. Germany retained some railway artillery, but concentrated on developing conventional heavy artillery that provided better tactical mobility. Britain took the opposite approach. As World War II began and the need for long-range fire support became apparent, British ordnance officers examined the nation's inventory of heavy naval guns, weapons removed from decommissioned battleships and stored in naval arsenals. These guns represented enormous investment of materials and manufacturing expertise, and they remained functionally operational despite being obsolete for naval warfare. The question was whether they could be adapted for land warfare in ways that justified their deployment. The answer was mounting them on heavily reinforced railway carriages that could use Britain's extensive rail network for strategic mobility while providing stable firing platforms for weapons that weighed up to 300 tons, including mounting and recoil systems. The guns themselves ranged from 12-inch weapons firing 800-pound shells to monstrous 18-inch guns firing 1,400-pound projectiles. These weren't field artillery. They were siege weapons designed to destroy fortifications, infrastructure, and concentrations of enemy forces from ranges where retaliation was impossible. The resulting weapons were anything but elegant. They looked like industrial machinery, accidentally equipped with enormous gun barrels, all exposed mechanisms, heavy steel frames, and obvious improvisation where naval systems had been adapted to railway mounting. But they worked reliably and delivered firepower that no conventional artillery could match across ranges that made counter-battery fire essentially impossible. The psychological impact. German forces first encountered British railway guns during coastal bombardments in 1940 and 1941, when British guns positioned near the English coast engaged German positions across the Channel. These early encounters created limited psychological impact because German forces understood that naval-caliber weapons could engage coastal targets from static positions. The psychological effect intensified dramatically when railway guns were deployed during the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations in northwestern Europe. German forces accustomed to conventional artillery found themselves under fire from weapons that seemed to violate all understood rules about artillery range and capability. Shells arrived from positions so far away that German observers couldn't determine their origin. The shells themselves were so large that single impacts created destruction that normally required multiple conventional artillery rounds. The sound was distinctive and terrifying. The deep boom of the gun firing was audible from miles away, but was so distant that German troops couldn't correlate the sound with incoming shells. The shells' flight created a rushing sound as they moved through the air, but the projectiles arrived so quickly after the sound that no evasive action was possible. The impacts created explosions and blast effects that conventional artillery simply couldn't match. Entire buildings collapsing, vehicles being thrown through the air, craters deep enough to provide shelter for an entire infantry section. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber commanded an artillery battery positioned to support German defensive operations and experienced British railway gunfire repeatedly. His assessment, recorded in reports that survived the war, captured the psychological dimension. The British super-heavy guns create effects beyond conventional artillery's capability. A single shell destroys what would require entire battery firing for effect. The gun's range exceeds our counter-battery capability, making retaliation impossible. Our positions receive fire from weapons we cannot see, cannot locate, and cannot engage. The psychological effect on troops is profound. They understand they're being attacked by weapons against which they have no defense. The inability to retaliate was particularly demoralizing. German doctrine emphasized counter-battery fire as primary response to enemy artillery. Locate enemy guns through flash spotting or sound ranging, calculate firing solutions, engage with overwhelming firepower until enemy guns were destroyed or withdrew. This doctrine was useless against railway guns that fired from beyond observation range, withdrew into concealment immediately after firing, and could relocate to entirely different positions between bombardments. The German countermeasures. German forces attempted various countermeasures against British railway guns, none of which proved particularly effective given the weapon's fundamental advantages in range and mobility. Counter-battery fire was attempted repeatedly but failed consistently because German artillery lacked sufficient range to engage railway guns at their operational distances. German heavy artillery could reach perhaps 12 to 15 miles under optimal conditions. British railway guns engaged from 20 miles or more, placing them completely beyond German counter-battery capability. Even when German forces managed to identify approximate firing positions through sound ranging or aerial reconnaissance, their artillery couldn't reach targets that were fundamentally out of range. Aerial attacks were theoretically possible, but practically difficult. By 1944, Luftwaffe resources were stretched so thin that conducting dedicated strikes against individual artillery pieces was rarely feasible. Even when aircraft were available, locating railway guns that spent most of their time hidden in tunnels, forests, or prepared revetments was extremely difficult. The gun's mobility meant that by the time German reconnaissance identified a firing position and organized an airstrike, the gun had likely relocated entirely. Several attacks were attempted, but none achieved significant success. Ground operations to capture or destroy railway guns were contemplated but never seriously attempted. The guns operated well behind British lines in areas where German ground forces couldn't penetrate. Even if German forces had reached railway gun positions, destroying the weapons would have required bringing up demolition charges or heavy weapons while under British counterattack. The operational risk vastly exceeded any potential benefit. The most effective German response was passive, dispersing vulnerable targets to reduce concentration, hardening critical facilities against bombardment, and maintaining redundancy in infrastructure so that destroying individual locations didn't create operational paralysis. These measures reduced railway guns' effectiveness at the margins, but couldn't eliminate the threat entirely. A gun capable of destroying a railway junction, ammunition depot, or headquarters with single shell created constant operational concern that forced German commanders to consider vulnerability to super-heavy bombardment in all planning. The operational employment. British railway guns were employed selectively against high-value targets where their unique capabilities justified the substantial resources required for their operation. The guns weren't used for general fire support. That was the role of conventional artillery. Railway guns were strategic weapons employed against targets where conventional artillery was inadequate. Coastal battery suppression was primary mission during the Channel operations. German coastal artillery positioned to engage Allied shipping or bombard British coastal areas was engaged by British railway guns from positions in England. The shells crossed the Channel at ranges where German guns couldn't effectively return fire, allowing British gunners to engage German coastal defences without exposing British positions to retaliation. Several German coastal batteries were damaged or destroyed through systematic bombardment that demonstrated the railway guns' precision at extreme range. Railway infrastructure became target priority during the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations. German forces depended on rail transport to move reinforcements, supplies, and heavy equipment. British railway guns could destroy marshalling yards, repair facilities, and critical junction points with single, carefully placed shells. The psychological impact was significant. German railway personnel knew that their facilities could be destroyed at any moment by weapons they couldn't see and couldn't defend against. Some railway operations were suspended during daylight hours specifically to reduce vulnerability to railway gunfire. Command and control facilities were engaged when intelligence identified their locations. A 1,400-pound shell striking a headquarters building ensured complete destruction, regardless of the structure's construction. Several German command posts were destroyed through railway gunfire, killing senior officers and staff while disrupting command structures at critical moments. The threat forced German headquarters to disperse, use extensive camouflage, and relocate frequently, all of which reduced their operational efficiency. Supply concentrations were targeted when reconnaissance identified large accumulations of equipment or materiel. Ammunition dumps were particularly lucrative targets. A single shell striking ammunition stockpile could create secondary explosions that destroyed material worth far more than the railway gun shell itself. Several such strikes were documented, with German reports describing catastrophic losses of ammunition and supplies to British super-heavy bombardment. The Falaise connection. The Falaise pocket encirclement provided ideal conditions for railway gun employment. German forces were concentrated in shrinking area with limited mobility, making target acquisition straightforward. The guns could engage German positions from maximum range, ensuring they remained beyond German counter-battery capability even as German forces were compressed into smaller area. Railway guns engaged German positions throughout the battle, targeting concentrations of armor, artillery positions, and potential escape routes. The bombardment wasn't continuous. Each gun fired perhaps a dozen rounds daily, but the psychological effect was disproportionate to the number of shells actually fired. German troops knew that at any moment a shell weighing more than a small car might arrive from beyond visual range and destroy whatever it struck. German reports from the Falaise battle specifically mentioned British super-heavy artillery as factor affecting morale and operational capability. One report noted, "British railway guns fire shells of extraordinary size against our positions. Impact effects are devastating. Entire vehicles destroyed. Positions obliterated. Personnel casualties severe. The guns operate from such extreme range that we cannot locate or engage them." Troops experience constant anxiety about potential bombardment, affecting combat effectiveness and willingness to remain in assigned positions. The accuracy at extreme range was remarkable. Spotting aircraft provided corrections that allowed gunners to engage specific targets rather than just bombarding general areas. Railway junctions, bridges, and headquarters facilities were hit with precision that demonstrated the fire control system's sophistication. Not every shot hit its intended target. Artillery is inherently imprecise, but the hit rate was sufficient to make the bombardment tactically significant beyond its psychological impact. The final assessment. Klaus Richter's destroyed railway junction was one of hundreds of targets engaged by British railway guns during the war. The junction was eventually repaired and restored to operation, but the repair required 2 weeks and diverted engineering resources from other critical tasks. The psychological impact persisted. German personnel working on railway facilities lived with constant awareness that their work could be instantly destroyed by shells arriving from weapons they couldn't see or engage. The British railway guns weren't war-winning weapons. They didn't fundamentally change the conflict's trajectory or decide major battles through their firepower alone. But they contributed to Allied victory through accumulated effects: infrastructure destroyed, German plans disrupted, morale degraded, and resources diverted to defensive measures. They were force multipliers that amplified conventional artillery's effectiveness through their ability to engage targets that other weapons couldn't reach. The gun's most significant legacy was demonstrating that obsolete equipment could remain relevant if employed creatively in roles that exploited their unique capabilities. Naval guns designed in Victorian era, mounted on railway carriages built during World War I, firing shells at German targets in World War II. The entire system was built from obsolete components, yet it worked effectively because those components were properly matched to mission requirements. German soldiers who experienced British railway gunfire never forgot the distinctive sound, the distant boom, the rushing whoosh of the shell in flight, the devastating impact that followed. They learned to fear weapons they never saw, fired from positions they couldn't locate, delivering destructive power that seemed impossible for conventional artillery. The shells were indeed as large as small cars, and they arrived with precision that defied their size and the ranges across which they were fired. The railway guns represented British engineering philosophy applied to modern warfare. Take existing equipment that seemed obsolete, adapt it creatively to new requirements, operate it methodically within its limitations, and achieve results that more modern systems couldn't match. The guns looked like Victorian industrial machinery accidentally armed with enormous cannon barrels, but they worked reliably and terrified German forces who understood that they had no effective defense against super-heavy bombardment from beyond retaliation range. The deep thunder that announced railway gunfire became sound German troops learned to fear across the latter years of the war, because that sound meant that somewhere within a 20-mile radius, a shell weighing as much as a small automobile was about to arrive with explosive force sufficient to destroy almost anything it struck directly. And there was nothing German forces could do except disperse, take cover, and hope that this particular shell was aimed at someone else. British railway guns weren't subtle, weren't mobile in tactical sense, and certainly weren't modern by mid-1940s standards, but they delivered firepower that no German weapon could match at ranges where German counter-battery fire was impossible. That combination of overwhelming power and immunity from retaliation made them psychological weapons as much as physical ones, creating constant anxiety among German forces who knew that super-heavy bombardment could arrive at any moment from weapons they couldn't fight back against. The shells were literally the size of cars. The impacts created craters you could bury tanks in, and the guns that fired them operated from such extreme ranges that German troops often believed they were being shelled by Allied naval forces that weren't even present. That psychological confusion, the inability to understand what weapon was attacking them, was as effective as the physical destruction the shells caused. British railway guns won through Victorian persistence, building enormous weapons that seemed obsolete, operating them with methodical precision, and destroying German targets with shells so large that single impacts achieved what conventional artillery required entire bombardments to accomplish.